star so bright. Pull your hat down, make sure your cinch is tight. Horse is kinda snuffy, cold chill up your spine. You'll get your ass moving, son, we're burning daylight.
Howdy there, I'm Matt McKinley and we're burning daylight.
In the saddle till the job's done right.
Welcome to Burning Daylight, the only podcast for the working cowboy.
Well, welcome back, Daylight Burners. I've got a really interesting special guest today, Sarah Stoneberg-Holt. She is from Montana, and she wrote a paper on the almost eradication of the American bison herd in the late 1800s, and she's got a whole different take on how the buffalo kind of almost went extinct, and it's a lot more natural causes than or unintended causes of removing a predator from an ecosystem. And I read your piece a while back. We've been playing kind of been in email tag here for a while, trying to get this set up. But I was reading back through your paper last night so I could refresh myself a little bit. But it's you make a very compelling case. So anyway, if you would give a little info on a little background on who you are and why you wrote your paper, and then we'll get into your hypothesis.
Well, hello. As you said, I'm Sierra Stoneberg-Holt. I'm up here in northeastern Montana, the flat, dry part of Montana, as some people refer to it. And I'm on a ranch that was established by my great-grandparents and my great-great-grandmother. So I'm approximately fifth generation here in this area, which gave me some advantages just in knowing the landscape from what I've observed through my lifetime, plus family stories, which is very helpful. But I also have a doctorate in botany. I did my undergraduate work here at Montana State University in Montana, but then I went to the Czech Republic to do my graduate work to get a little bit of a broader perspective there. So that's who I am. And the ranch itself is 50 miles of gravel from any highway, any schools, anything like that. So when the kids were little, what we ended up doing, rather than dragging them 2 hours into town and back for school, total of 4 hours a day, is I would homeschool and then work on the ranch, which gave me not a lot of time, but a lot of freedom to do some research. And so that's how I managed to, over many years, do some research into the bison question.
Okay. That's very interesting. We homeschool our kids as well, but I lived up I guess it'd been southeast of Big Sandy for a couple of months, and that kind of cured me of Montana ranch work. I spent one winter, and that was plenty. It was that Highline country is really, really cold.
It is. Yeah.
So I understand I know those 50 miles of dirt roads still going to take you 2 hours, because they're not good dirt roads. They're just dirt roads. And a lot of Nevadas. I'm out in Nevada now, and a lot of it's like that. But I'm a little closer to civilization than you are. So I guess I've got that. It's a gift and a curse. It's all at the same time. But so that part of the world, that had been kind of like like the summer grazing grounds for the bison, and then like the summer hunting grounds for a lot of those northern plain tribes as well.
Uh, yeah, I would think so. The one of the things that I think is important to realize about the bison is that, as far as I can tell, most of the major disruption had happened before there was any European uh, people to see it and to record it. So
Mm-hmm.
what we have recorded is already a majorly disrupted ecosystem, I think. That's the important thing that I found in my research. And so the problem is we don't know,
Mm-hmm.
because by the time Lewis and Clark, as Europeans, there's a tendency to think of Lewis and Clark as the starting point. You know, they recorded
Mm-hmm.
what had been here, but what they actually saw, as far as I can tell, it was a very disrupted ecosystem, a very new ecosystem, something that was in the process of being formed. And
Mm-hmm.
before that, there was something else, and I don't think we have a very solid idea of what it was. But yes, it's excellent country up here, and the one of the things with our ranch is Granddad set us uh, very nicely. With it's a very very small ranch, but our northern land is fairly flat and open, and our
Mm-hmm.
southern, just south of the house, is getting into the Missouri River breaks, and it's got a lot of uh, variation there. And so we don't actually hay or anything. We winter out. And so we've got summer range and winter range. And from that, I would say that, at least in our area, it would have been conceivable that the bison could have been there year round, because they're even better at
Mm-hmm.
pawing through the snow than the cattle are. And the cattle are quite good. And like the deer and the antelope in our area will follow our cattle herd, expecting them to paw through the snow for them. And I
Oh,
assume
okay.
that the bison did the same.
I would imagine so. I've not been around bison too much, but I like, yeah, eastern Montana is excellent when especially with moisture, the that grass is really hardy, and it's I mean, it's been known forever as good cow country. But I I think I tend to believe you're right on what you were saying, like pre Lewis and Clark. I think I don't think the native worldview was what it had been, say when the Spaniards come through. I think estimates that I've heard was 90% of the native population was wiped out by smallpox and other disease to which they were naive to. And that's, I mean, we had our global pandemic that supposedly killed about 2 million here in the United States, and I mean that's a like fraction of a percent of the country, as opposed to 9 out of every 10 Indians are just gone, and that's devastating. I mean, that's worse than the plague across Europe. I think it was a third of Europe got wiped out by the plague, or was it 2/3?
I'm not sure in Europe, but I would agree. What I have definitely also read where they were saying 9/10, and I think that was the upper boundary, but that
Yeah.
happened repeatedly. So there were
Hmm.
plenty of places where they were losing 9/10, and if they weren't losing 9/10, they were probably losing at least 3/4. And it's something I've asked the kids to imagine. Our little
Hmm.
town here, where I've got, now that they're a little older, they're going to high school and public school. It's roughly 100 people. And so I've
Hmm.
I've asked them to imagine there were only 10 people left in town. Which 10 would they be? One of the third graders, and one of the grandparents, and just to think about how that would completely devastate a small tight knit group like that.
Mm-hmm.
So in my area, the area that I'm familiar with, one of those epidemics went through the Blackfeet which were, I believe, our major group that was working here in
Mm-hmm.
1780. And that's about 25 years before Lewis and Clark came through. And we don't know how many of them died, but it was probably, in the vicinity of that 9/10. And so, yeah, what Lewis and Clark saw had already been destroyed, because the Spaniards brought the smallpox and the other
Mm-hmm.
diseases in the south, but there were so many trading routes through this
Yeah.
area. And so that was how our people way up here ended up getting it and getting that. It came in with the traders.
Mm-hmm.
There was a
Yeah.
luxury trading route along the uh, Rocky Mountains. I believe it was on foot, and that's where you would get, your parrot feathers and the fancy stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then the bulk trading route, of course, was on the river, because that was the logical place to carry, the dried bison meat and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. And so that was the Missouri River ran into the Rockies, which led down to the Santa Fe Trail, and yeah, there's like that. It was a small world even back then. It was a
Yeah,
lot harder to get anywhere,
yeah,
and I that makes sense to me when you see the reports of these massive buffalo herds. I mean, just thousands upon thousands, if not a million, that you hear from the settlers and the mountain men and the scouts pushing west, and and the story goes is that we starved out the Indians. We killed their buffalo herds to starve them out, which is partially true. There's no doubt. There's plenty of evidence of, particularly in like the Comanche area, where they would drive the buffalo north, or they just slaughter them on a mass scale. But when you start actually penciling out the numbers, and you're like, well, they really didn't even make a dent in the overall buffalo population. And it's very similar to the cattle population in Texas during World War, or during the Civil War, where the cattle population exploded because there was nobody culling the herd. There was very little of taking them to market. It was just these cow herds just ran wild for 4 years, and that was just 4 years, and created a beef boom, uh, which what led. I'm in the middle of researching the history of the meatpacking industry right now, so it all kind of ties in together. Um, and but if you imagine, say you had 30 braves on foot before the Spaniards, you know, pushing buffalo over a cliff into a box canyon or whatever, and however they hunted at the time, and now they're down to 3 people trying to do that same job. That's
yeah.
You can see how those buffalo herds can just multiply rapidly without whereas before maybe they were killing 200 animals, and now they're lucky to get one.
I absolutely. I agree absolutely. And you're right with it's a nice parallel with the cattle herds after the Civil War. Like you said, that's just 4 years. The bison had 25 years roughly,
Mm-hmm.
at least in my area. And I researched my area because I'm familiar with it. I know what to expect. I know what's normal now. So I was able to see when Lewis and Clark recorded things that were abnormal, and they did,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of damaged vegetation, damaged water cycles, things like that. And I'm just assuming that that happened in other areas at different time periods with similar results. But with those 25 years, there's definitely the opportunity for the population explosion without predation. And as any range manager knows, it's not necessarily just about numbers. It's about the management and keeping the herds
Mm-hmm.
moving properly. And so when you let that happen, when you let the management break down, either in the cattle after the Civil War or in the bison, and you stop controlling the numbers, but you also stop controlling how they're moving, then you cause so much damage that you stop being able to support the numbers you were able to support before. So even if you
Mm-hmm.
have an area that can, let's say, support, 20 million bison, and you have it supporting 20 million bison because you're managing them and, keeping the numbers where they need to be, you're keeping them moving the way they need to be moving. Then if you just all of a sudden 90% of you die and you're gone and you're not doing what needs to be done anymore. One, you'll get that immediate population explosion that always happens I think, when you take the predation away, you get the population explosion. But the resulting damage means that you're not going to be able to support that 20 million anymore. You're only going to be
Mm-hmm.
able to support a fraction of that, but you'll have even more, and it just creates a spiral. And it's my belief that that was absolutely devastating to the bison. They lost on so many levels.
Yeah, they really did, and uh, it's funny how like when you kind of map out the series of events, you had the Spaniards introduced smallpox in the South. You probably had the French and the English uh they introduced smallpox in the northern part of the United
Hmm.
States. And I don't remember what the estimates on the populations of the natives, but it was a thriving population of people here in the
Yeah,
United States. And we as in today's day and age, we think, you see the reservations, and you see you think of small pockets of Indian populations, which is what it came down to. But there was millions upon millions of natives living in the U.S. And I don't think necessarily living at harmony with nature at all times. They'll go. I think there was a lot of warfare, and they were just they're people like everybody else. But there was a whole bunch of them here. And then when we finally get to like the western extension of the United States, there really is only pockets of them left, and they're just a shell of what they once were. And then when you get this up in traffic of not just people but cattle and all sorts of other animals, you get the Texas fever tick that moves. You have whole laws wrote, like Kansas said, you Texas cattle aren't allowed here anymore, and they had to turn west and drive before they could drive cattle north, because Kansas said, well, we don't want any of your damn disease in here.
yeah,
And I'm not familiar as much with the anthrax deal in the Nebraskas, but the Texas fever thing was pretty devastating at the time.
absolutely. Yeah. Texas fever is really a problem. And the fascinating thing about it is that the idea that, well, it like the smallpox, you're looking at about 81% are going to be
Mm-hmm.
killed. But those that survive, assume they're emaciated. So assuming that they don't just, you know, fall off a cliff or something, those that survive then have an immunity to the tick. And so they're able to carry the tick, they're able to stay healthy, they're able to raise calves. And so then you have this herd of carriers. But if you get them away from the tick, and I don't remember the period of time, but they lose that immunity. and then the process starts over again. And so that's why the Texas cattle that were coming up from the south, where the tick is endemic, and I haven't seen any evidence that it was, somehow European or something. It's just endemic down south, as far as I was able to find out. So they had contact with the tick, and they would bring the tick with them, and they would be immune. Anything that hadn't, like Goodnight's cattle, which probably brought the tick to the bison and wiped out the bison where Goodnight settled. And then his cattle lost their immunity as soon as the Texas cattle came up in, 3 years later or 10 years later, however long it was. Then they started wiping out his cattle. And so
Yeah.
that I suspect possibly the Southern Railroad played a part in that, because that would have fragmented where they were traveling, and fragmented those herds, so that herds that potentially had been keeping contact with the tick and keeping an immunity would have been severed from the tick for a period of time, and that's all it took to wipe them out. And Kotsky found really good evidence that the northern herd, it was a matter, it was, and it was, I want to say innocent. Um, the Blackfeet had been promised a shipment of cattle as part of the treaty. And I don't know how many times, if you read the history of that they were not given things that they had been promised. But in that particular case, the herd of cattle was delivered as promised. And the suspicion is that somewhere in there was the tick. And that got into the northern herd, and that was then the end of the northern herd when they disappeared in 1883, from almost from 1 month to the next.
Yeah.
The herd just disappeared.
And it really is kind of a parallel situation with the smallpox and I forget what all the scarlet fever and whatever diseases that came over from Europe that wiped out the native population. It's kind of the same effect that it had on the bison population with anthrax and the tick, the Texas fever tick. And it's and then you compound that with with the blizzard of, was it 73, that also took out a lot of big players in the cattle business. And it was kind of a perfect storm of events, if when you look at it. It's it was just maybe God was just mad at the bison at that particular point in time. Just like they got hit from kind of every angle.
Absolutely. And well, one of the major theses in my paper, and the thing that I would say is truly original to me that I haven't seen somewhere else, is the idea that that the original Americans were actual livestock managers and were important there. And that just makes all kinds of sense to me, because they had, over 10,000 years. That's a long period of time. That a modern human brain, um they weren't busy playing on their computers or anything. So they had a lot of opportunity to observe, to try things, to change if it wasn't working. And just seeing how much my family has managed to learn in just 100 years on one plot of ground, learning how to manage, the difference that a little bit of intelligent shift in management makes for the water cycle is unbelievable. For the soil health, it just is amazing to see. And so from my point of view, I see these people with this opportunity, with 10,000 years to see what works, see what doesn't work. And the bison were so important to them. So they were always observing, thinking. And when you develop that level of human management and human interaction, right? If the bison had been alone for 10,000 years, it's completely conceivable to me that they would have developed their own uh, reasonable way of behaving, a good stable ecosystem. But they
Mm-hmm.
didn't have to. They had the humans to depend on, the humans to keep them moving where they needed to move, the humans to cull the herds the way they needed to be culled. And so, to my mind, the bison were, they were kind of helpless without
Mm-hmm.
their people.
Yeah. Uh, that makes sense to me. I mean, going back to the Civil War era Texas, where all the fighting age men were back east. Usually, I mean,
Hmm.
there was very little fighting done in Texas on the Civil
Hmm.
War front. There was a lot of skirmishes between the Mexicans and the Comanche mostly, um, but by and large, all the men went back east and fought on the front lines, and they left the women to take care of the and the herds, and more often than not, the herds didn't take care of, and it was yeah. So whether it be somebody with a band of with 50 head of cattle just for their own personal use, they'd maybe sell one or two here or there, but where you're not culling that calf crop every year. It's and they just suck. There wasn't a lot of fences back then either, so it was when you have a pretty intensive management system to no management at all, that leads to skyrocketing population, but then all sorts of other problems that come along with it, uh and it's partially why you'd think a very small sliver of the Indian population was able to thrive because with new technology plus an abundance of food supply. I mean, it's not an easy food supply to get to, but now with the introduction of horses, and we see particularly with the Comanche how adept they were at raising horses as well. They were excellent horsemen, but they were also stewards of the horse too. They were very very similar to like the Mongolian and the steppe. I mean, they were steppe people is essentially
Hmm.
what they were, and they were very adept at breeding and animal husbandry as well. So um, to think that doesn't translate to the bison herd, as I think that doesn't make sense to me. That it only makes sense that they would, like you said, they would pick up on the nuances of the animal and the ecosystem as a whole. That's one thing that the native people have always been known as is being very good stewards of of the ecosystem, whether it be slash and burn type farming or the even the nomadic type tribes that follow the buffalo. And it's not. I don't think they followed them. I think they pushed a lot of them. Like I think they were not only were they hunters, but they were herdsmen as well.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. I think you make excellent points. I really like the idea of the analogy of the Texas cattle herds because that's very similar to what happened on a smaller scale, shorter time frame, and something that
Mm-hmm.
we've definitely seen, and we've seen exactly how that played out. So that makes an excellent analogy, an excellent example of what we're saying happened here. And I liked the way you pointed out that the original Americans then ended up with a situation where they've got a fraction of their numbers, they've got bison everywhere, plus they've got new technologies that uh, help in hunting. So yeah, in that sense, things were pretty good. But when I think about their management methods, um, honed over, like I say, 10,000 years, but there was no written language. It was
Mm-hmm.
entirely dependent on trained individuals and oral transmission. So when you think about this this group that has 10,000 years of knowledge of how to manage this particular this herd of bison in this area. It's very place specific knowledge, and then you just wipe almost randomly 90% of them out. Uh, so much of that knowledge is going to be lost absolutely irretrievably. Not only do the Europeans, who don't even show up for another 25 years, except for a few French fur trappers, have no idea what happened. The people themselves are going to lose an amazing amount just because of that. I, I'm I believe smallpox kills relatively quickly, so they didn't even really have a lot of time to prepare. Just suddenly everything was gone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was as far as diseases go, it was kind of a real blitzkrieg type situation where it hit hard and it hit fast, and then if you survived it, like you're good to go, but also, I mean, there's just people dead all around you, and you're just like, "Oh, what the hell just happened?"
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
kind of how, and it's I've pondered on this many a times because I was a real nerd on military history growing up. So I when my friends were doing Pokemon or whatever, I was reading like battlefield strategy of Civil War stuff, and um I've got a lot of buddies that served in like special forces, and I like listening to them because they're very, as far as like big army versus like the special operations groups or small teams, that they're very very intelligent people and very adept at strategy and tactical level stuff, and they've gleaned a lot of stuff from the natives over the years, particularly the scouting and like the one man or small team type infiltrating behind. And the Europeans would have never succeeded in the new world if it hadn't been for a bunch of novel diseases.
Yep.
There's no way they could have beat the native population on their own soil at full strength. They're even with the huge disadvantage in technology that the native folks had, the sheer numbers and ability to move within their own ecosystem would have it would have been a bloodbath that had they tried to conquer the Europeans tried to conquer the new world at versus the full strength native population. Not a chance. And
I absolutely agree with that. I think that's absolutely true. I don't know if you've ever looked into Cahokia at all, but that was an absolutely enormous city for the time period, about roughly 1,000 years ago, I think. Maybe
huh,
about where
I'll have
Kansas City is now, if I remember. And and the thing about cities is, right, they have to import food. You just
yeah.
can't. Uh, and so I believe that they were importing tremendous amount of food from from my area. That was one of the big things, was that they would, because the groups in my area, they were 60, 80 people, maybe 160, maybe, not very
Mm-hmm.
big. And uh, as far as we can tell, because so much of it's been destroyed, but historically, they were killing about 1,000 bison a year. Bison's
Mm.
big. You don't need 1,000 bison. Most of that was for export. And so when you
Yeah,
had
had to have
times
been.
like Cahokia on the river, they would harvest it, they would dry it so that it was going to be transportable, and then they
Mm-hmm.
would send these enormous boatloads of food, just like we do today, on this same
Yeah.
area. We're still raising the calves and then shipping them out and feeding the East. And that's what
Yeah.
these people were doing here. And I mean, that's part of the reason why they were able to have, in my mind, such a successful ecosystem, right? Because they had a very tightly managed, um, and there was a lot of demand.
Yeah. And they were also very shrewd in the trading department too, which
Yeah,
also makes sense. Pemmican was like the original granola bar,
yeah,
and it was before there was, canned pork and salt pork and whatnot, there was pemmican and jerky, and they had found out through thousands of years of trial and error to how to. I think they say pemmican's got somewhere around a 15-year shelf life. That it's the stuff lasts forever, and it's very nutrient dense, calorie dense food. So it's the perfect food for a nomadic tribe. It really
Mhm.
is. If you can't have the fresh food, the fresh meat after a kill, then you have pemmican, which is just dried dried bison and fat, rendered fat, and some fruit. But it's for a nomadic culture, it's the perfect on the go food, and it lasts forever, and it's portable.
And it's also, like you say, it's ideal for supporting a city, a really large city in
Hmm.
pre-refrigeration times, because you can, like you say, you can fill a boat with it and send
Hmm.
it downstream. And I assume they sort of boiled it up or something once they got it downtown, especially for the fancy people. But it would have, that way 15 years, your boat isn't gonna take 15 years to get down to the city, so it'll be fairly fresh and
Yeah,
yeah.
that yeah makes sense. I'll have to look into that. Cause I've never heard of that particular city, so I have to look into that. But it's but you see it throughout South America and Mexico as well. They had like huge metropolis areas, and I think there was probably maybe not as quite on a grand of a scale as the Mayans or the Incans, but there was plenty of that throughout North America as well. And
Yeah.
you're seeing more of that evidence of that come out with there was that Ancient Apocalypse series on Netflix with Grant Hancock and Randall Carlson, and they've done some those guys. It's weird how they also get tied into like the really trippy hippie mushroom psychedelic community as well, because they're big on the psychedelics, but they've done some really interesting work on like historic civilizations, and I think there's a lot of evidence of that here in the Americas, um and there's just a lot that we don't know because, as you said, there wasn't any written language. It was all oral traditions, and um that makes it hard to go back when you wipe out a civilization and they didn't write anything down. It's hard to glean a whole lot of facts from there.
I think that's really true. I feel like if we had, diaries or something from Cahokia,
Hmm.
like we do from Rome, that we would see that they were, pretty much just like us. The
Yeah.
technology is really different, but at that time period, 1,000 years ago, it was the modern human brain.
Hmm.
I think that's one of the lack of written language is one of the reasons why we struggle to realize that the people here, were, like I say, just like us. They were wandering around, looking at stuff, thinking about stuff, figuring things out, developing things, making inventions, and so on. And so much of that has been lost.
Yeah. It really has. So when did you write this paper on the bison herd?
Well, the I uh, presented it at the National Grazing Lands Coalition in 2015. And then the rangelands version, which is the one that anybody can get online or whatever if they want to read it, that came out in 2018. So it's been a while back. And I spent many years on it. I don't know when I first, gosh, um, s- it might have been around 2010 when I had that first big epiphany when I looked at the Alan Savory pictures and realized that they were what I'd been reading in the Lewis and Clark, and that Alan Savory was observing a 30-year the riverbank after the humans had been removed for 30 years, and that Lewis and Clark was there 25 years after the smallpox epidemic had wiped out the people that were there. And when I suddenly said, I think this is connected somehow.
Yeah.
So yeah, 10 years now, it doesn't seem like that long.
That's what was the initial reaction to from, I guess scholars and experts on on the bison and historians? What was the reaction from like experts in the field, I guess?
It did kind of vary. A lot of the reactions were just really, really wonderful to get. People that I respected a lot, that I knew were very knowledgeable and had done a lot of work in the field, saying, wow, this is amazing. This makes so much sense. This is the missing piece that makes it all fit together. And that was always really exciting to hear, really nice. I did get the occasional, what are you talking about? We know that the hunters killed all the bison. Uh, why are you bringing up something else? And that was disappointing to hear, especially when I'd look at the numbers and I'd say, there's no support for that position, so I didn't know what to do with that. But
Well, yeah, when you put the numbers into play, because they estimated somewhere like not quite 1 million head taken out in a yearly hunt, but once they did the commercial hunting of the bison, it was almost 1 million head. It was about like 800,000.
actually, it was 1.2 million a year
1.2.
for 3
Okay,
years.
3 years.
So
So
that was Hornaday's estimates, and his Hornaday's estimates, I think, were pretty good, and probably, if anything, high side, which is what we want.
mhm.
Because he went through right away, 1880s, and the hide trade was a trade, so there were records and things, and he just
Oh yeah.
wrote to all these people and got those records.
Mhm. Yeah, because they're I mean that the hides, that was big business.
It was.
That was really big business. So yeah, that you'd have yeah, very very detailed counting of all that. It's
Yeah.
it I mean all the good businesses had very very detailed records. So it was it would make sense. Even the natives had detailed records of certain ex trades and goods and whatnot. Is and so we're talking 3.6 million in a 3-year period, when they're estimated the buffalo herd to be about 95 million.
60 million is a more common
Yeah.
middle of the road estimate. The largest one I've ever seen given is 88 million. But
Okay.
like you say, there's a lot of big numbers thrown out there, and 3 million over the course of 3 years. Those bison had to been having some calves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they because even when you hear some of the exploits from those buffalo hunters, I mean, that herd didn't move a whole lot while they would just sit way out with a Sharps 50 and just pick them off from range, and so that was their ideal way, so they could kill more that way. They could shoot them all without stirring up the herd and having to chase them down. So they were breeding the whole time as well, and they and of course there were herds all over the place too. So it the numbers just don't make sense when you you actually look at the numbers, it doesn't make sense that hunters wiped them out. It just it's a square peg in a round hole. It does not fit.
And I absolutely agree with that. I would say, well, the hunters, I think, on some level realized that they were taking a fraction of what they saw there, which works when you're
Mm-hmm.
acting as a predator. But what the hunters assumed was that the bison were normal and the bison were healthy. And so
Mm-hmm.
my thesis is that the bison, because of their catastrophic loss of management, were not normal, were not healthy. The vegetation wasn't healthy. The water cycle wasn't healthy. And so a level of hunting that, if that with a healthy herd, would, if anything, benefit the herd because you need some
Mm-hmm.
level of predation, was actually damaging it. But most of the hunters didn't see it. Most of the hunters were not out there to wipe out the bison. There were clearly, they've left letters and things. There were people a lot of times with the military who very intentionally wanted to destroy the bison. It was a
Yeah.
military decision to destroy the original Americans, and clearly those people existed. They left written record, but I don't
Mm-hmm.
even know that they actually went out and pulled the trigger very much. It was just it was their great big plan. It was something that they wanted to see happen. But the actual bison hunters, they didn't want to see the bison disappear. Like the fellow that
No.
said, "I was born in the bison trade. The bison are gone. I don't know what to do." They were
Mm-hmm.
devastated just like everybody else.
Yeah. Yeah. It was and I think on a small tactical scale, the army had a big effect on certain buffalo herds.
Mhm.
Like when they're trying to, you know, when they're trying to corral Quanah Parker, there was a
Mhm.
certain amount of buffalo that they were relying on. So you extinguish that herd, and then Quanah Parker has no choice but to give up. But
Mhm.
as a whole, yeah, I think when you see those accounts, it's a very zoomed in picture as opposed to
Mhm.
the 30,000 foot view. And
Right.
disease, I mean, disease is a huge thing for in any living ecosystem. But if you look at the Civil War, there was about 600,000 Americans killed. Roughly 2/3 of them died from infection and disease, as opposed to
Mhm.
their from actually the actual combat.
Yeah.
Um, there was, I mean, enormous numbers of men that lost limbs just from like a simple flesh wound that got infected.
Mhm. Yeah, and the disease, I think, works the same way. Um, I wasn't able to find evidence, and that doesn't mean that it's not accurate, but I wasn't able to find any good evidence that the diseases that killed the bison were definitely new to the continent. I mean, in the case of the smallpox and the human diseases, that was the problem. They were new to the continent. The humans had absolutely no kind of defenses, and that's what wiped them out. But the bison diseases, in looking through, I couldn't find that they hadn't necessarily already lived with those for, 5,000 years or whatever. So why did suddenly something that hadn't been causing any trouble s- cause near extinction? And again, just like with the predation, with the hunting, I think it was the combination of having lost the management and the fact that the herds were not healthy. They were not moving the way they were supposed to be moving. They were not doing whatever it was that we have no
Mm-hmm.
idea what was, that had been developed over 10,000 years. And so they were susceptible to the diseases. They were susceptible to the hunting in a way that they should not have been. They there was all kinds of starvation just because the vegetation was so destroyed. And again, that shouldn't have happened. Our When our vegetation is healthy, then our cattle are able to winter out there, northeastern Montana all year long. They go onto the winter range, which is the topography is better than the summer range, and they dig through the snow and they get to the grass. But if the grass had all been destroyed during the summer, there wouldn't be anything there. And I think the bison were also running into that. They'd go to the places where there should be grass for them to dig through to, and it would be gone because of the like I say, because of the loss of management, the loss of the intelligent human interaction.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And there's always like long term effects that people don't ever see. I mean, looking back at the COVID stuff, it turns out America's really fat and unhealthy. Like the vast majority of that of the COVID deaths were either elderly or just obesity played a huge part into that. And then to get into that, and they've been talking about the obesity epidemic forever, and a lot of it has to do with a sedentary lifestyle, and then the food supply is also a huge contributing factor. But sedentary lifestyle has played a huge part of the obesity crisis, and that's kind of, if you look back to the bison, where before they were managed and grazed along a certain path, and now say they just stick up there in northern Montana where grass is good, and they have you have a wet year with plenty of grass, and then maybe they just don't migrate south, and they get fat and lazy and happy there, and then they're not in fighting shape when a disease hits. Their immune system's not what it should be.
And we could definitely see that sort of thing in our area. When my great grandparents moved in here 100 years ago, there wasn't much management. When in the paper, I say that the people that were here, that my great grandparents and stuff, they were supplying predation to the herds, but they weren't supplying management. They were selling the calves and eating and things, but they weren't supplying a lot of management. And there was a lot of damage to the vegetation. The water cycle was really unhealthy. Stuff that my mother saw and told us about growing up. And then when my grandfather was running the ranch, then gradually he brought more fencing, more moving, more, intelligent management in. And then we started, my folks and myself, in 2000, 2004, 5, somewhere in there, and started very intensively and very intentionally making sure that everything was moving and that the grass was getting the proper rest and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And the difference is just absolutely amazing. We've got grass coming in areas that haven't had it since the 30s. We just believe that those soils didn't support grass. Well, it's not true. It's coming in. We've got hillsides that I don't I don't know how long they've been without grass. They've been kind of we were under an ancient inland sea in the Pleistocene. And some of those areas, I don't think they ever got grass back, but they've got some grass moving in now, which is crazy when you think about it, the time periods. And the water cycle has just been unreal. We've gone from bare streams and flash floods to this a fairly dry area, but streams that will run for several months. Absolute that's an absolute turnaround. And it was just um, it was from management in a fairly small area and paying attention to the grass and paying attention to the cattle, and the cattle are healthier than they've ever been. Uh, we've got the herd was larger than it had been before. And so when you think about, you know, they had 10,000 years of, like you say, making sure that the bison are moving from here to there and that the grass is healthy, and they very well may have been keeping track of, oh, this is good winter range, so we keep them out of here,
Mm-hmm.
using fire or spears or whatever it was they did. so that when we bring them back in the winter, they'll have something to eat. And like I say, the bison conceivably could have worked something out like that over 10,000 years on their own, but they didn't have to. They
Yeah.
had the people to depend on, and the brain of the human being is just so excellent for that kind of work. Why would you even try as a bison when you had the people to do it for you and do it really, really well? It was a great partnership. And then all of a sudden, one of the partners was just gone.
Yeah. And I think there's a tendency in particularly on the environmental, more on like the lefty environmental side, is to completely discount humans as a part of the ecosystem. Like and I think it's more of an arrogance point of thing, but like we're very much part of the ecosystem, and a lot of times the most important part, because we kind of have a managerial role of it, and there's this big pie in the sky idea of going back to nature, but in that nature there was still people. There were still people around that, like you said, that the buffalo just didn't do their own thing, and then when they were kind of allowed to do their own thing, they got sick and died in pretty mass quantities. It's a kind of a symbiotic relationship, like, even if you want to view the human as a parasite, which we kind of are, but it's part of the system, it's part of the cycle, and we play a huge part in that, and we always get discounted as a negative impact on an environment. But like, I don't know. Seems like we've done some pretty good stuff as humans as well. So it's there. I think that has to be factored more into the discussion around the the nature and the climate and the environment. Like you have to factor humans into it, because we're not really going anywhere.
Alan Savory really emphasizes, and I like this, how important the behavior is. And he, of course, was talking about Africa and the elephant herds and things. But that one section of holistic management that kind of crystallized this whole idea for me, he was talking about that area where they decided to have a national park, and so they removed the people. And like you said, the people had been there since time immemorial,
Yeah.
for really, really long period of time. And they had been interacting with the animals, doing all of these different things, beating drums, gardening, whatever, what they had worked out over that, amazingly long time period. And the government removed them so that they could have their nice little park without, people underfoot, as has happened so many times. And the result was absolutely devastating for that ecosystem. Some of the animals overpopulated. A lot of them just stopped moving in the way the people had been moving them in specific ways, and it destroyed the riverbanks, and it destroyed the water cycle, it destroyed the vegetation. And as Savory pointed out, people weren't gone. There were still people there, but they were scientists and park rangers and tourists, and they behaved entirely differently. And because they behaved differently, the animals behaved differently. And it was that behavior. There was no change in what animals were there. And the elephants, who had been behaving one way when they were interacting with the people, as soon as the people were removed, they started behaving differently. And so, in a lot of ways, I see that as what had happened to the bison. You had this specific group of people with these specific behaviors that were creating probably very beneficial behaviors in the bison, because, it had survived for 10,000 years. So the proof's kind of in the pudding there. And then you take them out, replace them with other people that behave very much differently, because even the original Americans were behaving completely differently, right? There was a tenth as many, and now they had the horse, and now they had the rifle, and that sort of thing. And even even had they wanted to continue their behaviors from, 2,000-3,000 years ago, they just didn't have the same number of people. They had different
Mhm.
technology, and they didn't have a lot of the knowledge that had died in the epidemic. So it
Yeah.
wasn't even possible for them to continue their behavior. And of course, the settlers, they behaved completely differently, and they didn't care. They were not interested at all in
Mhm.
continuing those old behaviors. And as a result, all the animal behaviors changed, and I think you could really see it on the vegetation, the water cycle, everything that was dependent upon. And suddenly you have this extremely fragile system that people didn't even know was fragile. You
Mhm.
know, you have all these explorers, and all they see is that there's endless bison. Oh, wow, this is so rich. We've got bison all over. And they didn't bother to look at their feet and say, look at this soil, look at this vegetation. This looks bad. This
Mhm.
is totally fragile. It was really unfortunate.
It's it's funny how things that look so stable can be so fragile too. I mean, you look at our supply chain. I mean, the COVID was a huge shock to everything. I mean, that that was I didn't think I'd ever see bare grocery shelves in the United States of America,
Yeah.
but we did there for a while, um, and it's the crazy part is we had the food,
Hmm.
the food existed. It was just supply chain. Yeah, it was a lot more fragile than we realized, and it, it's it's kind of funny how like one little element can throw a wrench into the whole ecosystem.
Absolutely. Yeah. I would absolutely agree with that. And like you say, if there's anything that humans are guilty of, and it might be specifically European abstraction humans, or maybe it's all humans, is
Mm-hmm.
this tendency to assume that what I see today is stable and sturdy, and it's going to be here tomorrow and next year.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's not. That was part of the thing. They saw bison all over, and they said, "Well, there's always going to be bison all over."
Yeah, yeah, and then next thing you know, they're just almost gone.
Right.
Yeah, it's pretty wild that that whole period of time from the end of the Civil War to World War I is one of the most fascinating periods of time in human history, particularly in the Western U.S. And I'm endlessly fascinated by all of it. And it's my latest episode that I did on my meat packing industry. I had to explain why I'm going so slow on it, because the more you read into stuff and the more you realize there's a whole bunch of other rabbit holes you got to go search, because it's all everything was interconnected. Whether it was the labor unrest, the monopolies, and but also just taking essentially a backwater swamp in Chicago and turning it into a major global power player as far as an economic standpoint goes, and that all was interlaced with the beef boom of Texas, the eradication of the native peoples, um the railroads. You can't talk about the meatpacking industry if you don't talk about the railroads. You can't really talk about the Western United States without talking about the railroads, and it's it all feeds into the downfall of the bison population as well. And I think when you look back on it, it was kind of I think your hypothesis makes a lot of sense. Makes with the pandemic or the epidemics of disease wiping out a bunch, and then it really was just a perfect storm of events that caused it caused really the native peoples suffered tremendously. Don't get me wrong, but the bison was like the true loser in that whole situation was the bison.
Hmm.
Um, their traditional grazing path gets cut in half by a railroad that they can't cross, and then their traditional managers are getting wiped out as well, and then the new humans moving in have no interest in them whatsoever, really. And yeah, it was the bison really lost out on that one.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It was really, really very tragic for them.
Yeah, it was. Interesting. So are you still researching this particular area, or have you moved on to other topics?
I haven't done a whole lot more with this recently, but I did find a book, um, sort of similar to Hornaday, where quite a early on somebody went through and found as much information as they could. It's a very large book, so if I got some extra time, I would like to go through that and make some comparisons and see how it all fit in. I definitely, just glancing through it, I did find uh, somebody talking about how the hunters had wiped out all the bison along this one river, and like to look at that some more, because I wasn't seeing evidence that he'd seen that they were actually killed or
Mm,
that he'd actually seen hunters. He'd just seen a lot of dead bison and assumed that was hunters. And I'm thinking that area might have been s- s- uh, a potential anthrax area, and anthrax
mm,
especially likes to spread in water holes and things like that. So I was wondering if that wasn't another situation where somebody saw a herd of dead bison and attributed it to hunters, but I wasn't
mm,
sure. And so I was
mm,
I was thinking of going through that book with that kind of uh, viewpoint and seeing if there was more evidence there or not.
mm. It's it seems like the Buffalo Hunter gets put in the same category as like Kit Carson, where they're writing dime novels about how he was 10 foot tall
Hmm.
and bulletproof and drank the blood of his enemies, when he was really about 5'4" and very soft spoken, and didn't particularly like to be around people a whole lot,
Hmm.
and was actually kind of embarrassed by the dime store novels that were wrote about him. But and I wonder if that was. But I guess if you don't know anything about anthrax and diseases in a huge ruminant animal like that, um, it's pretty easy just to chalk it up to them damn buffalo hunters,
Yeah, yeah.
and there's accounts all throughout history of claims being made with no evidence to support them at all, and so and that one, where particularly where there's not people involved like on the receiving end, I mean the natives to a certain extent, but um when you're just talking about animals, like there's maybe today's day and age it'd be a little different, but back then I don't think there was a whole lot of investigative journalists looking to see what actually caused the death of these, of huge numbers of buffalo. I think it was pretty just common practice to chalk it up to look at us humans, what we've done, and we played a part, but I think um well, as a rancher, anybody who works in agriculture, Mother Nature is she can be real petty at times, and there when she decides to do something, she's going to do it, and there's not much we can do to stop it. You can prepare all you can to withstand it, but that's about all you can do.
Yeah. No,
That's
absolutely true. We're not as all powerful as we imagine we are. The
no,
world isn't as stable as we imagine, and we are not as all powerful as we imagine.
I think that's a very wise statement. This has been a really good discussion. a fascinating topic, and I've got to go to a mutton busting here in a little bit, so we'll probably. But I'd love to have you back on. I know you're pretty busy, and you live out in the sticks, and I don't blame you. Like I said, I'm a little closer to society than you are nowadays, but that has its downfalls as well. But I'd love to have you back on and discuss this and more topics like it in the future. You seem very well read and very, very well researched, and I'd like to pick your brain some more.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. It's been fun talking to you this morning, and I'd be happy to talk again sometime, I hope.
You bet. Where I know I read your paper, but I can't remember where I found it at. Where do they find all of your stuff?
Okay, it's a Society for Range Management publication called Rangelands, and it's free online. The name of it's Reinterpreting the 1882 Bison Population Collapse. So if they can find the Rangelands website, they should be able to just download it and read it.
Perfect.
PDF.
I'll make sure and I'll find it, and I'll put a link in the description and the show notes, all that. And yeah, Sierra, thank you so much for your time, and it's been fun talking to you. Really interesting topic.
Thank you very much. It's been fun.
You bet. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and make sure you go read this paper. I think you'll find it interesting. For me and Sierra Stoneberg-Holt, move your ass. We're burning daylight.
Your eyes up in the morning, beneath the stars so bright. Pull your hat down, make sure your cinch is tight. Horses kinda snuffy, cold chill up your spine. We'll get your ass moving, son, we're burning daylight. Burning daylight. Burning daylight. In the saddle till the job's done right. Just together, and you won't catch 'em all. But when you ride through the gate, make sure you sit up tall. I can see the horizon, it's looking pretty bright. Well, get your ass moving, son, we're burning daylight. Burning daylight. Burning daylight. In the saddle till the job's done right.